Hi everyone, welcome to paper session 1 of today's Science Fiction Symposium on Artificial Intelligence and Generative AI. We're going to start with 3 paper readers that we have up in front of you today. I'm Wanett, Clyde, your moderator for this session. Everyone will have about 15 to 20 minutes to get through their individual paper, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A after that. Just a heads up that Professor Ellis will have to dash out for a bit, so don't be alarmed if he suddenly disappears. You'll notice that you have in your programs a bio of everyone, so we won't take up too much time reading through all of them. I'll just briefly tell you who will be speaking, and we'll go in the order of everyone that's listed in the program, starting with Professor Jason Ellis, who works here with us at City Tech and has been instrumental in getting this year's symposium off the ground and all prior symposiums, as well as facilitating the acquisition of the science fiction collection and helping me as the archivist and librarian manage the many books that we have gotten since then. Today, Jason's paper is A History of Generative AI in SF. Thank you, Jason.
Can everybody hear me okay without using the mic? Okay, cool. So this paper is part of a larger constellation of research that I began about 2 years ago. It started with the introduction of democratizing generative AI technologies that you could use and modify on your own hardware, such as Stable Diffusion for image generation and Meta's Llama for text generation. Unfortunately, these technologies work best with GPUs made by NVIDIA, which, despite a hit yesterday due to China's announced investigation into its monopolistic practices, is still worth over $3 trillion. Nevertheless, being able to use these technologies on my own computer made me feel like I was in the future for the first time. As I learned more about the use, development, and debates about these technologies, I began assembling an online bibliography of my research that I update on my website at dynamicsubspace.net. Also, I used my retro computing hobby to study earlier generative AI software from the PC's early days, which primarily used random number generators, small vocabulary databases, Markov chains, and fractal algorithms to string words together into text. These are also documented on my website at dynamicsubspace.net. Now, when it comes to science fiction, there have been countless presentations and publications on AI in SF over the years, thanks to so many examples of intelligence computers and sentient robots and androids in SF literature, film, television, and video games. In my current research, I am, however, most interested in the application of narrow AI, known as generative AI. Generative AI is a subset of artificial intelligence that leverages machine learning algorithms to create novel content, such as text, images, music, or videos, based on patterns and structures learned from large data sets. These models are trained on vast amounts of existing data, which they use to infer the underlying distributions and relationships that govern the structure and style of the content. By sampling from these distributions, generative AI models can produce new content that is similar in style and structure to the training data, but unique in its specifics. For example, a generative AI model trained on a corpus of science fiction novels might generate a news story that combines elements of different books, but with its own twists and surprises. This model doesn't simply copy and paste from the original text, but rather uses its understanding of language, plot, and character development to create something entirely new. The quality of the generated content depends on the quality and diversity of the training data, as well as the complexity of the algorithms used to process that data. While generative AI is not yet capable of true creativity or original thought, it has the potential to greatly assist human creators or even to create new forms of art and entertainment that blend the best of human and artificial intelligence. While generative AI is a significant subset of artificial intelligence, it's important to contrast it with the broader category of AI and how it's often depicted in science fiction. Artificial intelligence in science fiction often takes the form of sentient, self-aware beings that can reason, learn, and interact with humans in complex ways. These AI entities, like Mike and Robert A. Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, Isaac Asimov's The Brain and Escape, or Domino and Aldous Boudry's Michael Moss, are typically portrayed as having their own motivations, desires, and even emotions. They are often depicted as surpassing human intelligence in various domains, and sometimes even surpassing human morality. In contrast, generative AI is a narrow form of AI that is designed to perform a specific task, such as generating text or images. While it can produce remarkable results, it is still fundamentally a tool designed to assist humans rather than a sentient being in its own right. The most prevalent generative AI-type systems in SF are those that are capable of writing. Some examples include George Orwell's novel-writing machines in 1984, the fairy tale vocalizing Barr in Isaac Asimov's Someday, the expensive writer-assistant Yarner machines with, quote, 100 slots or so for the working tapes and films, and a mood control in Clifford D. Seamack's So Bright the Vision, and the verse transcriber computer and its many settings for poetic verse in J.G. Ballard's Studio 5, The Stars. In general, these stories reflect anxieties over the technological erosion of human art while critiquing the writing of others as being machine-like. Most do not delve into Gernbackian prophecy, but there are two that are more thought out and worth discussing in terms of their relationship to contemporary generative AI. The first is Jonathan Swift's 1726 novel, Gulliver Travels. In part 3, Gulliver makes his way to the floating island of Laputa and its subject kingdom below of Balnibarbi and its Grand Academy of Legado, which satirizes Francis Bacon's Ben Salem and its research institute, Solomon's House in New Atlantis from 1626. At the Grand Academy, Gulliver encounters the engine, and this is something I want to quote at length. Quote, "The professor I saw was in a very large room with 40 pupils about him. After salutation, observing me to look earnestly upon a frame which took up the greater part of both the length and breadth of the room, he said, 'Perhaps I might wonder to see him employed in a project for improving speculative knowledge by practical and mechanical operations. But the world would soon be sensible of its usefulness,' and he flattered himself that a more noble, exalted thought never sprang in any other man's head. Everyone knew how laborious the usual method is of attaining to arts and sciences, whereas by his contrivance, the most ignorant person at a reasonable charge and with little bodily labor might write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, laws, mathematics, and theology without the assistance from genius or study. He then led me to the frame, about the sides whereof all his pupils stood in ranks. It was 20 feet square, placed in the middle of the room. The superficies was composed of several bits of wood, about the bigness of a die, but some larger than others. They were all linked together by slender wires. These bits of wood were covered on every square with paper pasted on them, and on these papers were written all the words of their language, in their several moods, tenses, and declensions, but without any order. The professor then desired me to observe, for he was going to set his engine at work. The pupils, at his command, took each of them hold of an iron handle, whereof there were 40 fixed around the edges of the frame, and giving them a sudden turn, the whole disposition of the words was entirely changed. He then commanded 36 of the lads to read the several lines softly, as they appeared upon the frame, and where they found 3 or 4 words together that might make part of a sentence, they dictated to the 4 remaining boys who were scribes. This work was repeated 3 or 4 times, and at every turn the engine was so contrived that the words shifted into new places as the square bits of wood moved upside down. 6 hours a day the young students were employed in this labor, and the professor showed me several volumes in large folio already collected of broken sentences which he intended to piece together, and out of those rich materials to give the world a complete body of all arts and sciences, which however might be still improved and much expedited, if the public would raise a fund for making and employing 500 such frames in Legado, and oblige the managers to contribute in common their several collections. He assured me that this invention had employed all his thoughts from his youth, that he had emptied the whole vocabulary into his frame, and made the strictest computation of the general proportion there is in books between the numbers of particles, nouns, and verbs and other parts of speech, end quote. Swift's engine is an eerily prescient imagining of what generative AI and large language models do. The engine is described as a mechanical device that uses a combination of physical components and a vast vocabulary to generate text. The professor's goal is to use the device to produce a complete body of knowledge across various fields without the need for humans doing cognitive work. While the engine is a machine that relies on human labor, but modern generative AI is digital and works at scale. Swift's invention can be seen as an imaginative precursor to modern generative AI systems. These models are trained on vast amounts of text data and use complex algorithms to generate new text that is coherent and often indistinguishable from human-written content. Like the engine, they rely on the statistical patterns and structures learned from the training data to produce new content. And both rely on human beings to work with the text. In the case of the engine, to piece together bits of text into meaningful passages, and in the case of generative AI, to check for so-called hallucinations and otherwise edit the output text. The professors claim that the engine can produce a complete body of knowledge without the need for human genius or study is a satirical commentary on the hubris of attempting to reduce complex creative processes to mechanical operations. This theme is still relevant today as we grapple with the potential and limitations of generative AI in fields like writing, art, and music. The second significant text that I would like to discuss is Fritz Leiber's 1959 novelette, The Silver Eggheads. It was later expanded into a novel. The story illustrates a future in which humanity has given over its creative writing skills to mechanical devices called word mills. This opening scene from the story details their operation as well as sets the story in motion by their destruction. Again, quoting at length, telling a story, hoping we can wake up a little bit. If you're like me, you're half asleep right now. So this is a dialogue between father and son. Father, there you are, son. Look up at it, but you don't have to lean over backwards that far. It's big, Daddy. Yes, it's big, all right. That's a word mill, son. A machine that writes fiction books. Is it a robot, Daddy? No, it's not a robot, like the electrician or your teacher, though it too is made of metal and works by electricity. A word mill is like an electric computing machine, except it handles words, not numbers. It's like the big chess-playing, war-making machine, except it makes its moves in a novel instead of a game. But a word mill is not alive like a robot, and it cannot move around. It can only write fiction books. Kicking it. Dumb old machine. Don't do that, son. Now it's like this. There are any number of ways to tell a story. Still kicking it. Yes, Daddy. The ways depend on the words that are chosen. But once one word is chosen, others must fit with it. They must carry the same mood or atmosphere. I'll explain that later. Yes, Daddy. A word mill is fed the general pattern for a story, and it goes to its big, big memory bank, much bigger than even Daddy's, and picks the first word at random. But then it picks the second word, or when it picks the second word, it must pick one that has the same atmosphere, and so on and so on. Of course, it is much more complicated than that, much too complicated for son to understand, but that is the way it works. A word mill keeps telling one story with different words? Well, in a way, yes. Sounds dumb to me. It's not dumb, son. All grown-ups read novels. Daddy reads novels. Yes, Daddy. Who's that? Where? Coming this way, the lady with no top front on her dress. Look away, son. That's a writer, son. Still looking. What's a writer, Daddy? A writer is a person who takes care of a word mill, who dusts it and so on. Writers are allowed to dress and behave in uncouth ways like gypsies. It's all part of a union agreement that goes back to the time when word mills were invented. Now, you won't believe, she's putting something in the word mill, Daddy. Not looking. She's oiling it, replacing a tube, or doing whatever she's supposed to be doing in this word mill. Now, you won't believe what Daddy's going to tell you now, except that it's Daddy telling you. Before word mills were invented, it's smoking, Daddy. Still not looking. Don't interrupt. She probably spilled the oil or something. Before word mills were invented, writers actually wrote stories that had to hunt. The writer's running away, Daddy. Don't interrupt. They had to hunt through their memories for every word in the story. It must have been It's still smoking, Daddy. There are sparks. Don't interrupt. It must have been dreadfully hard work, like building the pyramids. Yes, Daddy, it's still boom. End quote. Word mills are described as machines that can write fiction books using a combination of random word selection and atmospheric consistency to generate coherent stories. Writers in this future are simply the technicians who maintain and control the word mills to create stories. The writers are not the authors of the stories, but rather the operators of the machines that produce the content. This raises interesting questions about authorship and the role of human creativity, which is discussed in the story and extends to current debates over authorship and copyright in generative AI outputs. Leiber's story also explores the tension between human creativity and the desire to automate the work of the human brain. Leiber has good fun making up names for these writers and the word mills that they destroyed during this Luddite-type revolt, such as, quote, Homer Hemingway axed through the sedate gray control panel of a Random House write-all, or Sappho Wollstonecraft Shaw shoved a large plastic funnel into the memory unit of a Scribner scribe and poured 2 gallons of smoking nitric acid into its indescribably delicate innards, and H.G. Heinlein planted shaped charges on an Appleton SF. The writers in the story are depicted as Luddites, destroying the word mills in a revolt against the machines that have replaced them. This theme is still relevant today as we grapple with the potential and limitations of generative AI. The connections between the word mills and the writers is further explored in a conversation between the writer Gaspard de la Nuit, who works for the publisher Rocket House, and its owners Flaxman, who bills his ancestor as, quote, a science fiction publisher in the great tradition of Hugo Gernsback, end quote, and Cunningham, who have played a behind-the-scenes role in having theirs and all the other word mills destroyed to leverage their secret weapon, cybernetically preserved brains of past writers, the story Silver Eggheads. Gaspard tells them, quote, I'm just a nuts and bolts man, a better than average word mill mechanic and nothing more. I really loved word mills. I enjoyed their products, sure, but I loved the machines themselves. Why, Mr. Flaxman, did you ever realize deep down in your guts that each word mill was unique, an immortal Shakespeare, and that's why there hasn't been a new one built in over 60 years? 500 deathless literary geniuses, unique and absolutely self-sufficient, end quote. Cunningham replies, quote, not quite self-sufficient, Gaspard, not quite. Men built the word mills. Men also directed them, just as ancient writers had to direct the activities of their own subconscious minds, usually in a most inefficient fashion, of course. The 2 activities involved in writers are the unconscious churning or proliferation and the inspired direction, the programming in the case of the word mill. Now, these 2 activities are completely separate in my opinion, and it's best when they are carried out by 2 distinct organisms or mechanisms. Actually, the name of each directive genius, never a writer in these days, of course, ought always to have appeared on each paperback or listen tape alongside the name of the originating word mill. But I'm writing my hobby away from my point, which is simply that a man is always the ultimate directive force, end quote. Closing the discussion, Gaspard replies, quote, maybe, Mr. Cunningham, and you were an ace programmer, all right? But I always thought Whittlesley Wordmaster 4 once wrote 3 serious best-selling novels and a science fiction romance without any programming at all. Maybe you'll tell me that's just promotion copy, but I'll believe it when it's proved to me. Just as I'll believe that my fellow monkeys can actually write books when I turn the pages and 2 consecutive ones hold my interest. They've been talking big for months now, but well, I'll wait till the juice starts to flow through their daisy rings and the words start coming, end quote. The conversation between Gaspard and Cunningham highlights the debate about the role of human direction in the creative process. Cunningham argues that men built and directed the word mills and that the directive genius should always be credited alongside the originating word mill. This aligns with the idea that the word mills, like generative AI, are a tool, but one of such consequences deserving co-credit with artistic writing production. This highlights the need for human involvement in guiding the creative process, even as AI systems take on more of the mechanical task. Gaspard's skepticism about the ability of humans to write books without the aid of word mills reflects the ongoing debate about the potential of AI to surpass human capabilities. His comments about waiting to see if humans can produce interesting writing without the aid of machines echoes the current debate about the creative potential of generative AI. As generative AI continues to advance, the question of how to balance human creativity with machine automation will become increasingly important. Lieber's story serves as a reminder that these concerns are not new, but rather been present in the past. By exploring these themes through the lens of science fiction, we can gain a deeper understanding of the implications of generative AI and its potential to shape our understanding of authorship, creativity, and the role of humans in the creation of art and knowledge. While I don't have time to get into the story's subplot of writing for robots and the role that Isaac Asimov's I, Robot played in that, I think it suffices to say, who is generative AI writing for, humans or robots? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. That did wake us up quite a bit. Next, we have Jacob Adler. Jacob has been part of the CUNY system for many years now and also has presented at our symposium quite often and is a fellow librarian working out of John Jay College. Welcome, Jacob, who will read The End Zone, AI as a Commentary on the Human Condition in, oh gosh, that's going to make my bad eyesight at 1776.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Very happy to see everybody this morning. So, sort of dovetailing off what Jason was talking about, when we talk about AI either in a fictitious context or as a real-world discussion, a lot of times it comes up in the modality of either being an oppositional force to sort of human development or something that works in tandem with it. What I want to talk about today is something that's a little bit kind of a third option. So the story that I want to focus on is a story called 17776. And just to set it up a little bit, because it's kind of an absurdist story and is very unusual. It was written and published in about 2017 by the humorist John Boyes. And as the title implies, it's set in a very far future time of 17,776 AD. The premise of the story involves this idea that humanity collectively has become this immortal, unaging populace and has used its sort of this time to create this post-scarcity society that's kind of free from poverty and inequality and a lot of the ills that plague us these days. And so somewhat bizarrely, in doing so, now a lot of their society is singularly obsessed with playing games. In particular, American football, which is largely what a lot of the story is comprised of. The sort of viewpoint characters of the story are these trio of real-life space probes that over the eons have acquired their own sort of consciousness and intelligence, essentially making them artificially intelligent characters. The main one being Pioneer 9, who is sort of the newest one to sort of achieve this consciousness and thus is very inquisitive and curious about the society that they're observing. There's its sibling, quote-unquote, Pioneer 10, who's positioned as sort of the wisest and most introspective of the three. And then there is the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, or nicknamed Juice, who is often presented as being very irreverent and sardonic and sarcastic. Together, all three of them comment on and to a limited extent interact with this bizarre football-obsessed future society, and they too have something of an obsession with it themselves. And one of the things that the story kind of touches on that is, I think, important to discuss as both sort of a theme and also an idea that presents itself when talking about AI is this concept of immortality and sort of the question of eternity. There is this kind of unspoken comparison to AI in that the humans of the story have kind of shed themselves of this fear or this inevitability of mortality, whereas an AI system is also unaffected by time passing in this way. In tandem with that is this idea that humanity, in its immortality, has largely preserved a lot of aspects of its society. Superficially or aesthetically, many of their buildings and architecture and a lot of the infrastructure of their world appears to be largely unchanged. The sort of darker side to that is that along with their immortality, there are also no new children being born. And so there is this concept of this being the last generation of humanity. that has no further newer sort of generations to replace it. It's interesting that this story was published before the generative AI boom because it kind of prophesied some of these concerns about modern day generative AI lacking new data in order to further iterate upon themselves and thus potentially reaching a state of stagnation. So the characters themselves kind of discuss this concept. 9 has a conversation with 10 in which they ask, why are people still playing football? They don't have anything better to do? And 10 responds, not really, no. And 9 quite reasonably asks, why not? 10 replies, the short answer is that they fixed all their problems. War, poverty, disease, those are all extinct remedies. 9 goes on to ask about themselves and how their place in this particular setup. They go, we don't do anything, right? There's nothing we're supposed to be doing. Just like all the people down there, we shoot the shit and watch football and waste time. And 10 responds, that's exactly it. That's the fate we share. Speaking for myself, that's the connection I share with them. I'm the least human thing you could imagine, but I feel like I'm like them. And so that leads me to sort of the natural point after that, which is this idea of what I call solving humanity. And what I mean by that is that now that all of the ubiquitous concerns of human society have been addressed, now that all the ills of humanity seemingly have gone away, what is there sort of left? And the solution that they arrive at in the story, somewhat comedically, is football. But this has a few other ideas built into it. For example, the elimination of material want means that there's a different valuation placed on things. One of the subplots in the story, there's an episode that involves a bunch of people trying to track down footballs that have been signed by this very obscure player, and so they're very limited in number. The sentimental value of these things is treated as having a much greater sort of emphasis and value for people in that story. Now, I said before that superficially a lot of aspects of the society have unchanged. The main technological difference is this, which is mentioned several times in the story, this ever-present network of nanomachines that essentially instantly repairs damage either to structures or to people, essentially rendering them invincible as well as immortal, which means that violence is usually not a concern for death either. And part of the conclusion that's reached later in the story is this idea of what sort of humanity's impetus towards exploration has yielded. Because it's pointed out that thousands and thousands of years of space exploration did not yield any results. There was no contact with life elsewhere in the universe. And so this has caused humanity to turn inward. It's caused them to become introspective, to turn towards what their life is on Earth. And to shape what it is that they are striving for. And this leads, somewhat bizarrely and unexpectedly to football. 10 has a monologue later in the story in which she says, people defeated scarcity. Everyone had what they needed and nobody got sick, but they found they needed things to be just a little bit difficult once in a while. They needed to stub their toe and wait in line and see that check engine light. They decided to leave their existence just a little short of perfect because they wanted to want. She goes on to say, people have found their home and their eternity. They have decided that this is their final state. Humans were once explorers and conquerors. That was their embryonic stage, a stage which is now finished. And this leads to the idea that now that they have decided to become sort of invested fully in the idea of play, what does that sort of mean now? And what does that mean in reference to sort of when we're thinking about AI? Well, one of the things that comes up quite often in the story is the emphasis on the rules of play, even when those rules seem completely ridiculous or outlandish to us. There's an incident early on in the story in which a player is physically swept up in a tornado during one of these football games and deposited hundreds of miles away, and there are rules to account for that. The rules of their existence, even though they have changed, perhaps to an unrecognizable degree to us, are still cataloged and followed obsessively. Now, obviously, there is a link to the idea of AI, because what is AI if not a system that obeys a set of rules on its own? either entered via programming or generated via interaction. These are things that sort of link, perhaps inextricably, the characters below on the ground, and also these space probes that are trying to understand all of this. 10 goes on to say near the end of the story that struggle, true unfabricated struggle, is a cocoon that they have shed. They have achieved their final form and are resting in an eternal moment. They are creatures of play. They will be creatures of play until the end of time. And Juice, in one of his rare moments of insight, has kind of a belated response to this, in which he says, the point of play is to distract yourself from play being the point. And so what does this all kind of lead to? Because all of these ideas are wrapped up in a single kind of overarching idea. And that's this idea of purpose. The story, whether it means to or not, has this point that it is making, that machine intelligence and human intelligence is ultimately only really distinguished by their purpose. And whether it's a similar purpose or a vastly different one, that's kind of the determination that it is using to distinguish them, or in some cases, liken them to one another. If that purpose is aligned to a great enough degree, if it becomes kind of one and the same, then it invites a lot of questions from us, the audience, about what it is that constitutes that purpose and what it is that constitutes the beings that follow them. Because once you eliminate this idea of time and mortality, then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the difference necessarily between a human and a machine at that point, other than just the materials that they are composed of? And so then their psychology and their philosophy comes into question. Both of them in the story reach a state in which they exist as perpetuations of themselves. They're not dedicated to some higher ideal, or at least not one that arises during the narrative. They're dedicated to becoming that which they already are, if that makes any sense. And so, if, as the story purports, the ultimate state of humanity is play, what is an AI, if not an entity which facilitates its own form of play? Because as we see with modern day, systems that are referred to as AI, what is it that they are doing if not concatenating all sorts of different data points, thousands upon millions of them, and in a sense, playing with them to reach a conclusion, to construct some sort of original thought? That's what the humans of 17776 are attempting to do in their own way. And so as the space probes align themselves with that purpose, they too achieve a kind of humanity, although perhaps not one that fits our current definition of it. And it's funny that this story was published before a lot of the discourse on AI arose, because I found that a lot of it is sort of starting to align in this direction anyway. So this is a quote from Joshua Geller's writing for the Global AI Ethics Institute. In it, he says, lacking the ability to empirically verify the existence of consciousness, all we have are external interpretations of internal states and observations about the environment in which entities act. If we assume that no one interpretation is any more valid than another, we invite a kind of dynamic subjectivity that permits variable determinations about personhood. If we consider AIs either fictional or real, and we start to think about their personhood, it's going to require, according to this, a shift in our perspective and in our definitions of what that is. Similarly, Elena Popa of Jagiellonian University writes, there is a substantial difference between biological organisms and artificial systems. The former can be attributed goals such as survival and reproduction, while the latter are designed for purposes specified according to a research program. Bringing this together with the concept of autonomy as identification and pursuit of goals, it follows that AI systems can work on their own in the pursuit of a goal, but that goal will be set by humans. And so when we think back to what we've been thinking about in terms of purpose, if an AI is independently choosing to pursue the same goals and purposes as a human being, does that not, in a sense, make it human? And I want to leave with one more quotation, this one from Daniel McShay from Duke University. Earlier, 10 was talking about how human beings wanted to keep desiring things. They wanted to want. And McShay here wrote a whole essay about the possibility of machine wanting, about what a machine that wants something would look like and how that would come about. In his conclusion, he writes, if we finally succeed, if we eventually figure out how to build a machine that can honestly tell us what it would like to do this afternoon, what will it say? For most questions about wanting, preferring, caring, the answer will, I would think, be highly predictable. We need only calculate the resultant of the various fields directing its behavior. And sort of the grand point that I want to leave everyone with is that the consciousness as a quality of a living being is something that could one day apply both to human beings and to machines. And what does human consciousness look like, or is defined as, once that arises? Does it, perhaps as this story proposes, result in just a big football game? Perhaps. So I want to thank everyone for coming. This is my first time presenting here in person after being on Zoom for God knows how long. So very nice to see some faces looking back at me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
That was extremely interesting. I'll have to make note of this story. Next up, we have Marty Loos. Loos. I almost got it. Almost. Marty is a Dutch PhD candidate joining us from NYU in the Department of Comparative Literature. I believe this is your first time presenting?
On this side of the Atlantic, yeah.
Welcome, Marty, who will read Plea for Theory, the relationship between real-world AI and its representation in science fiction.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as said, it's my first time on this site, so it's very exciting. Thank you all for coming out. From science fiction to reality is what Wired magazine called an article on the then still developing AI back in 2015. More recently, last year, Futurism titled their article on the unbelievable advances in artificial intelligence from sci-fi to reality. Ars Technica also last year did their article on AI-generated text, Sci-Fi Becomes Real. Apparently the cliche, science fiction becomes reality, is alive and well. In fact, this year, the New York Post called an article on general artificial intelligence just that. Is the sci-fi cliche about to turn real? There appears to be no escape from both the cliche and the fascination with the alleged predictive powers of science fiction. Sensationalist headlines aside, there's a genuine and understandable excitement at the core of the cliche. Artificial intelligence of various kinds is a core trope in science fiction. If you borrow the concept of the megatext from Damien Broderick, then AI is one of the big players in the science fiction megatext, which is the background of intertextual relations with other science fiction works against which a specific work operates and accrues a large part of its semantic value. Hence, AI is one of the icons of science fiction, to borrow a term from Gwyneth Jones, alongside the likes of time travel, death race, aliens, you name it. With the debatable exception of space travel, none of these icons of the megatext have been technologically realized before, perhaps explaining why the sci-fi becomes real cliche has seen such an uptake in relation to AI specifically. In this sense, the science fact of AI does indeed seem to be catching up to the science fictional side of AI. Yet, for example, transformer-based deep learning neural networks are nothing like the AIs of science fiction, from Asimov's humanoid robots to the disembodied intelligence, such as Kubrick's HAL, or the AIs that we see in William Gibson's works. It appears that both real-world AI and science fictional AI are somewhat confused terms both separately and comparatively. And even though there might be some overlap between the two, the main dividing line between the two seems to be the autonomy and agency ascribed to the science fictional counterpart of AI. The future might change that. The two categories hence seem to be light years apart, but it does not stop the likes of policymakers, AI researchers, science communicators, technology pundits, commercial AI companies, and more from using science fictional representations of AI to discuss real-world AI. Now, what does that mean? What is happening here? And what is at stake when a literary genre becomes a prominent representational model for real-world digital technology? Science fiction does not exist in a vacuum in regard to AI development. The representation of fictional AI, no matter whether it's accurate to the AI that is actually being developed or not, provides a backdrop of assumptions and expectations against which AI is interpreted and assessed. That is, the light in which we depict fictional AI steers and influences our interpretation of real-world AI. Or, more anecdotally, it's highly likely that there's a difference in how a fan of the Terminator and a fan of WALL-E view the advent of AI. In a meta-study done by Stephen Cave and Kantaji Hall in 2019, they cite a multitude of ways in which science fictional AI can influence real-world AI. By influencing AI researchers, by influencing public understanding, acceptance, and uptake of AI, and by influencing the regulation of AI. These avenues of influence can happen more passively, for example, by the cultural consumption of science fiction, and more actively, for example, by science communication that uses science fiction as its model. In the extensive 2023 study by Sarah Dillon and Jennifer Schaefer-Goddard, they interviewed AI researchers on what they read. Perhaps to no surprise, science fiction was listed as the most read form of fiction. AI researchers felt that reading science fiction is, and I quote, part of their community. Dillon and Schaefer-Goddard conclude that science fiction has a real influence on AI researchers, including, I quote, researchers here, research focus, career choice, community formation, science communication, ethical thinking, and the modeling of socio-technical futures, end quote. So there are real relations at work here. Yet how this relationship between reading science fiction on the one hand and AI development and research on the other hand exactly works is hardly theorized. Nor is much work done on what this relationship might mean. Next to the more innocent phenomenon of AI researchers reading science fiction in their spare time, there is also an increasing commissioned science fiction work that depicts AI either positively or negatively so as to influence policymaking, effectively making science fiction a political tool. This phenomenon similarly never really asks the questions on what the nature of that influence might be. It just assumes that there is some sort of relationship that can be manipulated. And there seems to be some basic agreement that the way in which AI is represented in science fiction has an effect on the perception and development of AI in the real world, which leads to the proliferation of work aiming to employ, manipulate, or exploit this relationship, be it negatively or positively. To me, this seems to signify the need to theorize the exact relationship between science fiction and real world AI. A crucial insight is that this relationship can also work the other way around, and that part, I believe, is often overlooked. While science fictional portrayals of AI do influence the development, interpretation, and regulation of real-world AI, the opposite is also true. Real-world AI also influences how its fictional counterpart is portrayed, and what a science fiction author can do with fictional AI. A point that many seem to miss is that the development of real-world AI is also a contribution to the science fictional megatext, influencing how science fictional AI is written, read, and understood. Hence, in this instance, representation is a sort of complicated field. So we have science fiction texts that influence AI developers, whereas the AI that they develop becomes part of the science fiction megatext, and in that sense influences how we interpret science fictional AI in the first place. This points to an intricate relationship between reality on the one hand and fiction on the other hand, which is further complicated because, returning to the cliché, this relationship can change historically. Science fiction can become real. This envisions the relationship between science fictional AI and real-world AI as if it were a unidirectional phenomenon rather than a feedback loop or perhaps a dialectic. And I think that work can be done there to sort of reframe that relationship. I maintain that it is necessary to pluck apart the assumptions and the preconceptions underlying the relationship between science fictional and real-world AI if one is to interpret what this relationship in whichever direction might actually mean. Considering the relationship between science fiction and the real world in a unidirectional way is a fundamental blind spot, one that at best leads to an uncritical flourishing of cliches, such as sci-fi is becoming real, and at worst opens the field to manipulation, potentially affecting the development of cutting-edge technology. Hence, I suggest that a healthy dose of theory developed in science fiction studies can contribute to a more critical approach of this relationship. To demonstrate this, I will primarily turn to science fiction studies maestro Darko Suvin, who I guess many of you here know, and a seminal definition of science fiction as the literature of cognitive estrangement. I will use this definition as a theoretical groundwork from which to analyze the relationship between science fictional and real-world AI. I maintain that the first thing that a science fiction theory should aim to do is to theorize what science fiction does, so that one has a basis from which to approach questions on what science fiction might mean. I suggest that this is a question that is best approached from a comparative angle, by asking what science fiction does differently from other genres. Darko Suvin, as said, comes to the rescue here. His understanding of science fiction hinges on two terms, estrangement and cognition, and their necessary and sufficient interaction in the literary device of the novum. I argue that all of these terms have specific relevance to the representation of AI. Time to unpack that. Estrangement is a term which Suvin takes from Bertolt Brecht's Vervreemdingseffect, and it refers to, sort of paraphrasing Suvin, paraphrasing Brecht here, so bear with me. It refers to the underlying attitude and dominant formal device of science fiction. That is, it leads to the depiction of a world which is not our own but could be. By factually reporting the science fictional aspects of the tale, Science fiction confronts the reader's set normative system with a point of view or look implying a new set of norms. The result is a representation that estranges, which allows us to recognize its subject but at the same time makes it unfamiliar. Yet estrangement on its own is not enough. To differentiate the fantastical from the science fictional, Suvin couples estrangement with what he calls cognition. That is, he demands that the estrangements of sci-fi happens in a cognitive mode. In theory, this means that, quote, science fiction sees the norms of any age, including emphatically our own, as unique, changeable, and therefore subject to a cognitive view. In practice, that means that this is where the science in science fiction comes in. It is not strictly necessary for the estrangement to be scientifically possible. Think of soft sci-fi, or think of like the more obscure technobabble in Star Trek. It nevertheless needs to exist in a cognitive continuum that dictates that it might be possible. Reliance on logical thought and empiricism within an estranged representation means that science fiction deals less in real possibility and more in ideal possibility, which Suvin takes to mean, quote, any conceptual or thinkable possibility of which the premises and or consequences are not internally contradictory. I think one can already start to see how this might complicate any claims of science fiction becoming real. Estrangement and cognition are useful in the definition of science fiction as a genre because it sets it apart from other similar genres. I quote Suvin again here. Estrangement differentiates science fiction from the realistic literary mainstream extending from the 18th century into the 20th. Cognition differentiated not only from myth, but also from the folk, fairy tale, and the fantasy. This way, estrangement and cognition are both necessary and sufficient to the genre. In fact, they are intrinsically linked, as the cognitive nucleus of the plot co-determines the fictional estrangement itself. The property of being cognitively possible and not internally contradictory, while it is obviously not our own reality, automatically creates an estranging effect. Cognitive estrangement is most typically achieved by a literary device that Suvin calls the novum, a term that he takes from Ernst Bloch. And the novum is perhaps most familiar to us as the science fictional trope. Suvin defines it as a, quote, cognitive innovation that is a totalizing phenomenon or relationship deviating from the author's and implied reader's norm or reality. Crucially, it combines these two things that I just talked about, estrangement and cognition. It exchanges the fictional world from us, but is nevertheless cognitively possible. The novum comes in many guises. Quoting Suvin, quantitatively, the postulated innovation, that is the novum, can be of quite different degrees of magnitude, running from the minimum of one discrete new invention, such as a gadget, a technique, a phenomenon, or a relationship, to the maximum of a setting, spatio-temporal locus, an agent, a main character or characters, and or relations basically new and unknown in the author's environment. End quote. It is here that the novum begins to take on a familiar form, a time-traveling spaceship, generalized aliens, and, yes, science fictional AI. Here we also see the overlap between Jones's icons of science fiction and Suvin's novum. Yet, what I believe is important is that what Suvin adds to theory here is that he theorizes science fiction as a genre whose megatext has a very particular and specific relationship to reality. So, I claim that it is here that we can find a firm theoretical basis of what science fictional AI is, namely a novum, and what it does, namely cognitive estrangement. Positing science fiction as a genre that revolves around representing novae that, validated by cognitive logic, estrange the represented world from the author's and reader's own set of empirical norms, means that science fiction, as said, has a complicated relationship to reality, as Suvin's distinction between real possibility and ideal possibility demonstrates. It does mean that science fiction for Suvin is about the present and not about the future. Here Suvin finds himself amongst other utopian theorists such as Tom Moylan and Frederick Jameson. That is, quoting Suvin, the cognitive value of all science fiction is to be found in its analogical reference to the author's present rather than in predictions. That is, estranging from a prediction would not be estranging at all. Rather, it would mean less or more informed futurizing, a phenomenon that we often see in science fiction but is neither inherent nor necessary to it. At the same time, science fiction has a tenuous relationship to the near future, as a novum that is too obviously almost scientifically possible implies an all too similar set of norms to our own, meaning that estrangement cannot take place in the first place, and hence disqualifying it as science fiction. So, taking AI as a novum a la Suvin has several important consequences. I want to list some of the considerations that I believe that taking such a theoretically based approach adds to our understanding of the relationship between science fictional and real-world AI. These will also be my concluding remarks. First, the nature of estrangement means that strictly speaking, the moment that sci-fi becomes real, following the cliché, it is no longer science fiction. Following Suvin's theory, a novum is required to estrange the empirical set of norms of the author and the reader, the colloquial real in the cliché. Suvin accounts for this when he mentions the novum's unalienable historicity. Because of this, science fiction is, and I quote, always bound to a particular time, place, and social linguistic norm, so that what would have been utopian or technological science fiction in a given epoch is not necessarily such in another. Unquote. I claim that this explains the long history of the megatext of science fiction. What once may have been science fictional may now no longer be. If technology develops, so do the set of norms of the author and the reader. This means that what is now science fictional AI may be real AI in the future, as it no longer estranges from the historical set of norms, but has become the set of norms of the present. It also means that the moment sci-fi becomes real, it is no longer sci-fi. The crucial notion that science fiction is a historical genre is exactly what is forgotten in the unidirectionality of the relationship between science fiction and the real-world AI that I spoke of earlier. The development of real-world AI might not just change science fictional AI, it might even make it no longer science fiction, making the cliché of science fiction becoming real a moot point. Second, the demand for cognitive estrangement means that the relationship between representation and reality is a two-way phenomenon, rather than a unidirectional relationship. That is, if science fictional AI narratives are a reflection of our hopes and fears towards these technologies, the fact that the narrative is in a cognitive rather than in a mythical or fantastical relationship with real-world AI means that our hopes and dreams are not only represented in science fiction, but also that our hopes and dreams are shaped through science fiction. Or, as Suvin puts it, the mirror is not only a reflecting one, it is also a transforming one. To some small or large degree, science fiction shows not only what we think about AI, but also dictates what we can think about AI. Third, the novum's peculiar relationship to empirical reality is not one of prediction, but rather one of critical interpretation. The prediction of technological developments can be a fun thing. You will never hear me argue against it, but it is always strictly secondary to science fiction's main effect, the spore effect, which is cognitive estrangement. Because of the nature of cognitive estrangement, the novum displaces and therefore interprets reality. Even when a far-flung future is represented, the cognitive value of the novum means that said future is always in direct relationship with our own present. Science fiction does not represent the future of our present, but rather, as Frederick Jameson puts it, turns the present into history. The estranging quality of the novum that presents us a world that is not, but could be, can be fruitfully compared to Donna Haraway's formulation of science fiction as pointing at, I quote, an absent, but perhaps possible, other present. In more concrete terms, and relating it back to AI, it matters not so much what science fiction predicts AI to be in the future, but more what that prediction says about our present, and how that present might or might not compare to an ideal possibility of the role we want AI to play in our societies. Hence, a more critical and theoretically substantiated approach to science fiction prediction is guided by a different set of questions than does science fiction accurately predict the future, and its little sister, has sci-fi become real? Instead, I maintain, it asks questions such as, what are the conditions of possibility for the prediction? What meaning is ascribed to the prediction's effects? And what can tracing the future historical development of the predicted technology tell us about ourselves? I maintain that these are the sorts of questions that should inform any analysis of the relationship between science fictional and real-world AI, especially if these analyses make a claim to what is real and what is not, or when these analyses try to manipulate the development of AI, be it positive or negative. Manipulation of a relationship that does not rest on a firm theoretical basis is ultimately grappling in the dark when it comes to questions of meaning and interpretation. Hence, a plea for theory, to help us critically approach science fictional AI. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, part of which Jason will be here for. He's going to dash out and then return with our keynote speaker.
Hi, Hi. First of all, Vivian, thank you guys so much. What a great way to start us off. I really, really enjoyed all three of your talks, and I think they worked well
Together.
together,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, definitely. Great job there. I'll address Jason at another time. Jacob, one thing I found really interesting in your talk was this idea of play, but also in this idea of our existential destination, right? Like, when are we completely developed? And how do we know that? And I think that's really interesting. And what I liked what you were saying was about the idea of play being sort of like the opposite of what AI can do, because there's this sort of unexpectedness about play, right? Not only in football, unless, you know, I want to read this book because, like, are the games fixed? You know, right? But like this idea of like the human ability to play, even as adults, of wanting to want, I think is something that goes back to all of the things we talked about, that you guys talked about today, what separates us from AI. And this sort of anxiety that has existed since, you know, time immemorial, like at least Margaret Cavendish, about like the fear of technology taking away our humanity, is becoming so much more palpable now, and it's kind of been laying dormant for a few years. Like, it's been like in science fiction, but now it's so mainstream. This like, AI, and so, that should be a T-shirt. AI. But what I wanted to talk to you guys about, I wanted to hear from you. Like, what do you think about this idea of when we are really, really good at something, like what Jason was saying about the language machine with Swift, but also in Swift. They tried to extract sunbeams from cucumbers. They tried to change fecal matter back into food. So all of these like really weird things. But like this idea of like, okay, have we mastered something and now we have to move on? And so we allow technology to take over the things that we don't think we have mastered. And we lose the play, right? So I want to know what you guys think about like this idea of how do we decide what machines should do for us? That's a really big question.
Thank you. That's a question that I find myself confronted with a lot. You know, I've worked in CUNY libraries for quite some time, and you know, a few years ago, ever since a few years ago, I've been very involved with talking to both educators and students about sort of its first of its sort of purpose in academic research, but it sort of has gone beyond that. The analogy that I always use when I'm describing, you know, sort of the use of these generative systems to people is that I always say to them, you have to treat the information that it gives you as if it came from some guy. Now it's some guy that has access to millions of different data points, but it's still some guy you don't know. You know, I always hesitate to call the systems that we're using these days to even refer to them as AI, because I feel as though in a lot of people's imagination that implies, you know, consciousness and self-determination and self-awareness, whereas despite what a few very odd people might say, we're not quite there yet. What I would say, though, is that I think the idea, it's funny, I think the idea of play and sort of its use in computing and machines is something that I think goes back to many, many decades in terms of how we use technology. You know, some of the earliest advances in terms of like graphical or processing power were so that people could use computers for gaming. And for play, and for sort of maybe more frivolous uses than, say, like figuring out missile trajectories or something. So, you know, the question of what's going to become to our humanity with advances in technology that I'm circling back to, well, we've sort of already answered that question in the sense that humanity isn't really going anywhere, for better or for worse, you know, just based on advancements in technology. I'm reminded a few years ago I was involved with a presentation up at Bronx Community College that was sort of right at the beginning of all this ChatGPT stuff. It was becoming a really big thing. And I think one of the best people in CUNY to talk about this is this fella Jack Koenigsberg from Hunter. And he was talking to a bunch of teachers, and he said a lot of things, but my favorite of his quotes is when he says to them, you know, if you're giving your students an assignment and they plug it into ChatGPT and they can get a B+ paper out of it, then you need a different assignment. It's not so much that I think we're going to lose or gain any sort of humanistic qualities from this. I think we just have to shift our thinking about sort of how we approach that and what that means. And I think that, as my fellow presenters have been saying, I think the fiction also is going to have this kind of liminal shift in terms of, well, because our reality is reflecting maybe some of the science fiction postulations of yesteryear, going forward we're going to have a sort of change in perspective about that. So that's sort of my short, long answer for that.
Do you want to add anything to that, Marty?
Maybe, yeah. So when it comes to Plea, which I'm not very knowledgeable about, but I think is Johan Huizinga, who wrote Homo Ludens, like somewhere last century. He introduced this concept of the magic circle, right? So he claims that Plea is like you enter a magic circle in which different rules count, and we all agree on that implicitly, and that is when the play commences, right? And so in that sense, it might be very interesting to see whether that is that a form of programming or not, so to speak, whether that's whether you can make a analogy there, but also do we need a form of consciousness to switch on the programming of the magic circle or not, right? Because if not, then AI plays, right?
I suppose so.
But I don't know if that's like a useful, or that's a useful way of looking at it or not. I just didn't think of that.
I'll tell you one thing, ChatGPT doesn't know when you cheat at chess. They know the rules of chess, but they don't know when you cheat. So I think that's, there's one thing to have the rules of play, but there's another thing to have the process of play. So.
Interesting.
Is there, or I guess you first.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry Jason already knew that I was running late, so I couldn't hear everyone's talks. Hopefully I can read your papers after I leave anyway. So one thing that kept coming to mind, and sort of I think connects, actually just reminded me of what Vivian was saying, thinking about play, and then you were talking about the magic circle, and I couldn't help but think about and all this sort of Freudian and psychoanalytic sort of ideas. So I kept thinking about, well, if we're thinking about estrangement, so I heard this is really interesting, and then I started thinking about the uncanny, but I'm wondering sort of what AI doesn't have, is an unconscious. So where does that figure in? Does it figure in at all? I started to think, because this has to do also with our desire, play, other human, very human, experiences. And then I also so this is just a question that may not have any helpful answer, but I do wonder about, we're also not only conscious beings, but we have, many of us believe we have the unconscious as well. So that's one question, where does that figure into the conversation, if at all? And the other thing I kept thinking about was where would, the Lacanian idea of the real, or what is real or not real. So are we always estranged? Some people might not like this question, or it might not work in a lot of these discussions, but I just kept thinking about that, because so is that something that science fiction is taking us into another sort of space of the, what even is real? Are we always estranged from ourselves? And that. So if any of those things can be threads we can respond to.
Well, I think for Suvan at least, the estrangement is always in a cognitive mode, right? Now how cognition exactly figures into psychoanalysis, I'm not sure. I'm not very big on psychoanalysis, but I think that is the important consideration there.
So there would be sort of no place for the unconscious if it's all consciously, cognitively, cognitive awareness, not.
I think I'm going to have to pass.
Okay, no, I'm just curious. Okay, it's interesting, yes.
Yeah, but it's a threat, I think. I don't, as far as I'm aware of, I haven't seen psychoanalytic readings of Suvan.
Yeah.
So that could be very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Marty, I really liked your point on how it's not just a one-way relationship. It's that real-world AI influences fictional representations, but also vice versa. That fiction influences how it's developed. That's really very, very good point. But I actually have a question for Jacob. What do you imagine AI would do at the current rate of development, given the same opportunities if given the same opportunity as humanity, to be in an isolated state of unendingness, of immortality, right, without humanity as a significant factor, if we continue our current path of development and it gets, substantially better than it is now, how would its experiences of immortality differ from ours? Would it emphasize play, do you think? Or do you think it would have a fundamentally different experience of reality?
Well, I'm not a computer science expert. My training is in library science. So, well, no, I say that just to bring up that I'm more sort of familiar with the effects of it more so than the building blocks of it. But there's kind of two answers to that. One being that there is no reason to assume that an artificial intelligence would treat the passage of time the same as a regular a non-artificial intelligence. I don't know what the term. You have to keep changing my terminology every 2 seconds these days. And secondly, it's one thing I sort of alluded to in my presentation, and some of you have probably seen news articles about this, is that without new information to feed into any kind of machine system, it starts to kind of collapse in on itself after time. It gets kind of stagnant. You could say the same thing about a human being, really, in kind of a grander philosophical sense. So I think the idea that was sort of presented in the work I was looking at is that you always need new stimulus. You need sort of new, for a machine, I suppose, input in order to keep generating new outcomes. And so I think, this concept of sort of immortality and the passage of time, I think, is coupled more specifically with this idea of, how do we continue to give, either ourselves or some kind of other intelligence new experiences? How do you continue to desire something or want something or have a goal to work towards? And I think that's sort of the question that, if we sort of get to the point where we have actual literal AI, that's a question that is going to have to be grappled with, and much smarter or maybe much crazier people than me are going to have to come up with the answer to that.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Miller, Chair of English. Thank you so much for being here. Martin, I wanted to say that it was helpful hearing you say science fiction once science fiction is reality, then it's no longer science fiction, some line along those lines. Because I spend a lot of time just, shaking my fist at AI as I get all the instructors coming to me, what do I do with this paper that's AI? So I kind of hate it, but this is helpful to me. And also just to start to think of it as our reality as opposed to this thing that is in its own, siloed location. Which is sort of how I've been thinking about it, like it's something I have to battle versus, this is part of, it's no longer fiction, this is so crossing over that line. It's just helpful to me, just a comment, thank you.
I had 2 comments. One of the things that, and maybe this is true for you too, Jacob, Kel and I as librarians have been thinking a lot about something that hasn't come up yet, how wasteful AI is, and how much water it uses and the impact on our lived environment, which is not addressed in the stories that came up today. So which maybe wasn't a consideration when they were being written, right? Like the use of real world materials to create this digital intangible thing, or even the literal space that servers and and whatnot take up the heat they put out. So that's something that's kind of in conflict with the solved problem, right? Like we solve all of our issues, but have they been solved if we don't address the environmental impact of of the machines? And then also with the concept of being a Luddite and the concept of play. Immediately when everyone is obsessed with football, like I would never be obsessed with football, and I'm in league with the community of people who make things, right? I immediately replace playing football with like endless knitting, right? Or like endless painting, endless sewing of garments, or something, all things that have its own version of automation, but also cannot be accomplished without human intervention, right? Like a knitting machine has to be programmed by a person. Every garment in a store has been touched by human hands. You cannot fully automate the sewing of an item, right? So it's the same sort of loop that we keep striving to automate it as much as possible to eliminate paying humans, to do those jobs, but it's literally not possible to eliminate all human interaction with something as simple, perceived to be as simple as a garment. And so I'm thinking also about how, AI becomes real, and that generative AI is a thing that we saw, we're talking on a cell phone, like we haven't learned to beam ourselves up yet, but there's lots of things that have become true. But in my opinion, some of the first things that became true was the wardrobe in a lot of science fiction stories, and the ability to, I'm thinking of in Butler, garments that self-close, garments that are made of plant, fibers. And so I think that's something that is missed, sometimes in discussions about how computer things, I think, are more like one-to-one. I saw that and read that in science fiction 40 years ago, and it came true now. But I think there are lots of other physical things for which that is also true, that don't receive as much attention. I was just jotting things down as you all were speaking, and that I immediately thought, like, everybody's not going to play football. like if it was the I get it's a story, and that's just it simplifies writing the story. But I think I would more readily believe that groups of people became fixated on a thing rather than solving problems, and that even still humans would not be unified in one task in which they spent their time doing.
Probably not.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions? We have about 5-ish minutes.
Just say also, you were just saying, just to add on, also the exploitation. I know that maybe there was an article in one of your bibliographies, or someone may have mentioned that the human beings who are literally exploited and traumatized by, because they're the ones. So there's this, like, to demystify where the AI is coming from.
Yeah. Which really comes up in the story in Jason's presentation, with the writers sort of being this thing like, can you believe they use their brains, kind of thing, in the sabotage of, of the machine, so that we can take back, that hand skill. It's the same thing with sewing. Every 5 years there's an article about how, like, knitting is bad. Yeah. It's not just for grannies. It never was just, for grannies. It's the same article every 5 years. We'll never reach a point. We'll never reach a point where people don't read paper books, or people don't desire that over, an electronic one. So there's like parallels in these arguments even before you get to the AI argument.
I think that there's these multiple layers of exploitation in the real world implementation of generative AI and other, how AI is being developed right now, that, at least these stories from the past, had no conception of, that they didn't know what was going to be going into making these, both the human side, where people are paid very little to do extraordinarily difficult tagging tasks over the vast reams of data that have been fed into these large language models for training. Or like you saw on one of my first slides, I call NVIDIA the drug dealer, because they purposely built in inefficiencies and limitations on their hardware, so people have to buy more things to do the AI training work and the inference work that we all get from, like, using ChatGPT or other types of end user systems, which then is what's contributing to, like, using more power, using more water for cooling. So the exploitation, which boils down to, these are capitalists that are gonna capitalist, and it's gonna hurt all of us in different ways. And I'm hoping, at least for, personally, that there are people that are trying to do a better job of democratizing how some of these things can be used and how they can be built. Because I mentioned using Meta's Llama, which is quote unquote open sourced large language models. There's still all kinds of restrictions. They're developed by a company that is worth billions and billions of dollars. That feeds into that system of exploitation. So I'm hopeful there's going to be some way that the people are going to have some sort of participatory AI development, which there are people working towards, but it's still in progress.
To maybe stay in the theme also, science fiction and AI, if these questions interest you, a novel came out last year or the year before, I believe, which is Ray Naylor's The Mountain in the Sea, which deals exactly with this and also has intelligent octopi. So it's a novel of ideas. It deals exactly with these exploitative backgrounds to the development of AI and also other future technologies.
Which I guess can only be a trend now, right? That we know the impact. So lots of things are predicted in science fiction stories, but maybe not other than, the one I'm most familiar with, Butler, who has absolutely written environmental impact, into her stories. That is something that maybe everyone had not considered to the degree which they can do now, and future stories will include that a lot more. Thank you so much. Oh, do we have one last question before we go to break?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is fascinating. I got me thinking about some of the stories last year about AI going off the rails already, and like Sydney trying to seduce a journalist to meet his wife and all that. And I remember one of the theories is that AI is just, it's simulating that because it's read stories where AI tries to break out of the box. And I guess I'm just wondering, given your expertise, if that's the case, does that make you feel more like optimistic or pessimistic if AI is imitating some of the things it's finding in sci-fi?
It's a little terrifying.
I have a lot of potential answers to that question. I will say just from my own experience that when I first learned about the sort of the generative AI boom, I guess at the couple years back, my initial reaction was one of horror because I come from like I have a bachelor's degree in English, and so I was thinking like, oh my goodness, nobody's going to write anything anymore, their language is going to die. And then about 10 minutes passed, and my wife showed me an email she had gotten as part of her job that had needed some help. And then the thought occurred to me, maybe there are people out there that need a machine to write things for them. So I think as with anything else, you sort of have to take the good with the bad, and hopefully the good will outweigh it. I do think it's funny that a very literal interpretation of maybe what you're talking about, if an AI is deliberately aping, a fiction about AI in order to construct its responses. I hadn't even thought of that before. That's very fun.
And a little scary.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sitting and enjoying and having really great discourse, in this first paper session. That was a great way to start the day. We have a little bit of a break until 10:50-ish when we'll start the second paper session, which will be moderated by my colleague, Cal.